I thought it's not going, but it was going. I just didn't see it over here to my left. Very good. Okay, Tricarico, it's all yours.
Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us. Let's go ahead and do introductions real quick. So I'm Tricarico, my pronouns are they, them. I'm a resident of Ward 2 and a member of the Human Rights Commission, and I will pass it to Mike.
I'm Mike, and my pronouns are they and them, and I am a resident of Ward 7, and I'll pass it to Kathy.
Hi, I'm Kathy Ostran-Fonchen. I'm a resident of South Salem. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'll pass it to Mr. Atchison.
Thank you, Dan Atchison, City Attorney. And just for anyone watching along, we don't have a quorum today for the meeting, at least at this point. So we're going to go ahead and go forward with the discussion, but it won't be an official meeting of the work group.
Thank you, very good. And my name is Gretchen Bennett, and I'm staff to the Human Rights Commission and use she, her pronouns. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. So yeah, as Dan said, this is really more of a informal discussion due to not having quorum. Does that mean that we can skip the public comment, Gretchen?
I also don't think we have any. I've not received any, so
okay.
Yeah.
So the main purpose of this task force is to look at the idea of introducing housing status as a protected class in our Chapter 97. I know that other cities have done this. I'm actually looking at the city of Madison, Wisconsin. I believe they were one of the ones that we identified to see if I can find the specific language, but we invited Dan to kind of ponder the legal implications of that. Dan, is there something you can kind of start us off with, or things we should consider as we look at this?
Sure. From my perspective, Chapter 97 of the Salem Revised Code, the Human Rights Chapter, is set up a little bit differently than most of our chapters, in that it relies heavily on the state human rights, the Civil Rights Code, ORS Chapter 659, I believe. And so if you look at our code where it talks about discrimination and public accommodation and housing and things like that, it basically says a violation of that section is a violation of the corresponding chapter to the state code. So if we were going to have housing status as a protected class, so to speak, just from my perspective, it would take a bit more time for us to rejigger Chapter 97 in order to create some authority for it and to create an ability to apply it. That wouldn't be as simple as just adding those words to the sections of the code. So it would be a bit of a rewrite from that perspective. The other piece of this is that eventually when the Human Rights Commission gets around to considering this, they would need to make a recommendation to the city council on whether or not to do this. And then council would have to adopt that recommendation or something close to it in order to get the actual drafting underway. That's really it for the legal concerns. Maybe some practical concerns from the attorney's perspective. Typically, what happens when there's a violation or a complaint under Chapter 97 is those come to the Human Rights Commission through Gretchen. There may be some investigation of a sort and some consideration. A lot of times, Gretchen will reach out to the different parties to try to figure out what's going on and to counsel them. In some cases, that can be referred to the state, the DOJ, who has its own civil rights enforcement arm. Because, like I said before, our violations of our code we piggyback onto the state code. So, as far as an enforcement mechanism, if this isn't a violation under state law, we would need to think a little bit about how we would enforce it, other than just the counseling process that Gretchen does.
Okay, so I guess my next question would be, does that mean that we should be talking to DOJ and get their perspective on this? Or, are we allowed, and I apologize, there's dogs barking in the background. Um, are we allowed to enforce something that isn't in alignment or the same as state code? Like, how does that work? Because that kind of made me wonder, like, okay, do we actually have any teeth behind this if it isn't a state law?
No, we could, we would have to create it as an independent violation of the Salem Revised Code. Right now, what we define as a violation for the current protected classes is if it violates state law, if it's discrimination under state law, then it's a violation of our code. So for housing status, we couldn't do that because housing status isn't a protected class under state law. So we would have to just write it a bit differently and perhaps set up a different enforcement mechanism within our code for that particular violation. You're on mute.
I just wondered if it's helpful to think about the types of situations that we might be able to predict or kind of get at what remedy or what problem we're hoping to address and what remedy, we're hoping that might contribute in to help with clarity in the conversation. Thinking about what's led you to think about this idea, what are the situations and the potential remedies that you see?
I think for me personally, it's that I know that our homeless population is not treated well. I know that they're asked to leave. I know that they're discriminated against. And a lot of the times we can use some other form of protected class because that person happens to also have a disability or whatever. But there's still a large percent of that population that doesn't fall under any other protected class. And so they do endure that treatment. And I also think it would really set the expectation for the rest of the city that we don't treat people poorly just because they're unsheltered, right? We don't get to dehumanize people just because of their unfortunate circumstances. And I really get frustrated with this mindset that just because someone is unsheltered, that they chose to be that way or they deserve that. And that's really where I'm coming from this, of setting the expectation and then also being able to actually support people when they are experiencing that discrimination. So I'd love to hear anyone else's thoughts about that.
I have similar thoughts to Tricarico, and in particular, what we saw in the discrimination survey this year in those 200 or so paper copies that were distributed to unsheltered people. It just shows that there's a wildly different experience that unsheltered people are reporting compared to the general population. My question, Dan, when you first started talking, was you talked about how doing something like this isn't as easy as adding, housing status, and that you would need to do some work to establish authority and have some language around that. Do you have a sense for what, because one of the things that is actually really important to me with Chapter 97 is that it's fairly readable, that people can actually hopefully understand some of it. I know legal language is perfect from that perspective. You all use longer words than the rest of the people, but I wondered if you had thoughts about how a city goes about establishing that type of authority and that type of policy. What kind of language do you typically drum up for that kind of case?
I don't have any specifics that I can give you. Just from the general way that the chapter is set up, as I mentioned before, we're going to need to sort of create a separate section that specifically addresses housing status. And I think a good definition of what that means, and addressing some of Tricarico's comments, I think the difficulty in applying it's going to be if you've got an individual, regardless of their housing status, that is violating the law, From the police's perspective, they're there to enforce the law. And certainly I don't disagree whatsoever with the concept that folks who are unhoused probably experience a wide variety of discrimination and a wide variety of application of the law that other folks don't get applied to, at least not as consistently. But I'm thinking from the perspective of a police officer who's received a complaint that there's someone in front of a business either having a mental health crisis or blocking a sidewalk or something like that. The officer still has to respond to that and still has to try to resolve the situation. So how this would be applied in that situation to me is a little unclear, I guess. I'm not sure how it would happen if you've got an individual who's unhoused, who's violating an ordinance. The police still need to have the ability to enforce that ordinance regardless of the person's housing status.
Yeah,
I have to pause though for a second, Dan, because I think you just totally switched subjects. A law violation of any individual, no matter what their protected class, is a law violation that is dealt with, and it could be a person of color, it could be an LGBTQIA person. The law violation is completely separate from the kind of goals of Chapter 97 around discrimination issues. So it just feels like we just took a 180-degree turn on subject, because the subject is about discrimination and how do we prevent discrimination, and law violations to me are a totally separate issue. It's not like having Chapter 97 that protects BIPOC people has prevented the police from enforcing the law in any circumstance. And so I think if we're talking about unsheltered people as this like special class where we have to write it in a certain way in case they violate the law, that it just feels like we just really took a totally different turn on subject to me.
I don't want to speak for Dan and let him, but I know one of the things that we hear with some frequency is, why would there be exceptions? Like the mask rules came out recently from the state and exempted people who were unsheltered. And we received some input from the community. Why would that be? Why wouldn't everyone need to follow the mask mandate? So I don't mean to speak for Dan, but I wonder if it would come out of some spaces of lack of clarity on when and how. I'm thinking about the Madison, Wisconsin example, Tricarico, that you brought up at the beginning, and I read in their information that the 2 violations that were reported under their inclusion in their human rights code at the city was about bathroom use. And so just to play out an example, I wonder if a person who was unsheltered and used a bathroom in a place of public accommodation and did not break any behavioral rules, if the person was kicked out only because they were homeless, maybe that would be a violation. But if the person created damage and maybe broke the sink and broke the mirror, and then they were kicked out, that would not be a violation because they committed a damage to the property. So I don't know if that helps us with some extra information. But Dan, I didn't mean to jump in for you if you wanted to share thoughts.
No, I don't want to argue with Mike, but I guess my point is that potential discrimination can occur when law enforcement is applying a law unequally. And it's a tough situation for law enforcement to be in when that happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hear you, Dan, and I think that's exactly what we're trying to prevent, because sometimes the laws about loitering or any other public thing are applied unfairly against people who are unsheltered, specifically because they are unsheltered, because there's a lot of people who don't want unsheltered people to exist. And I'm not really sure what they think the solution is, but unfortunately, until we have some major changes in our society, there are going to be unsheltered people. And ironically, those are often the same people fighting against the very services that would prevent unsheltered people from having to be unsheltered. So yes, we absolutely can hold unsheltered people to the law, just like we do every other person, just like Mike's point of, no one is prevented from being held accountable to the law because of their protected class. But it is a common occurrence, and we have documented evidence because of our survey that unsheltered people are being discriminated against solely for being undiscriminated. If you're curious, I invite you to read the survey. There's some really heartbreaking testimony where unsheltered people are simply minding their business and existing in public space, and they're being harassed. And the other thing that it is a concern, Dan, that there are some times where it's going to conflict because historically our laws have been written to be discriminatory towards unsheltered people. Where do you think loitering laws come from? Those weren't written to keep anybody safe. Those were written to keep unsheltered and low-income people oppressed. So yeah, it's going to be a challenge, but no one here is saying we're going to grant a magical exception. We're actually trying to fight the existing discrimination that's coming into play. And that's where I think working with law enforcement would be helpful, as well as making sure that we do understand what are the interpretations of this? How will this be applied? That's where I said perhaps DOJ can be a resource on that, because it is going to be challenging.
I would encourage the commission to come up with specifics as far as the recommendation to council on what type of discrimination we're looking at and how you'd want the city to apply it.
Okay.
Dan, I have a question about process. Is the recommendation that the commission would make to council a conceptual recommendation, and then you or someone else would come up with the language, or how do they? Okay. More than just and I'm not saying you would do this, but more than just a sentence saying that we recommend that the council direct staff to create an amendment to the chapter to protect, housing status. You need to put some more gloss on it than that. But as far as the specific code language, you leave it up to my office.
Okay. I wondered if it would be helpful to address some of what's come up today about preemptively explaining that what it isn't is a request for special dispensation. As was observed earlier, it is problematic if laws are enforced in different ways with different communities, and that comes up. I mean, I field quite a few calls from the community who feel people who are unsheltered sort of get out of having to live by. Why do they have their garbage all over, but I don't get to have mine? Why do they get to dump their garbage and I don't get to have mine? That's a common diatribe. And so I think it could be helpful to specify that's not in the idea, but then also to be clarifying what the opportunity is. One of the things that I imagine, I don't know how you feel, but I imagine will emerge in this, just like it emerges in the rest of our human rights work, is addressing those sort of microaggressions or oppressive comments that emerge, like when someone, like some of the items that appeared in the student survey, when people will drive by or walk by and make disparaging remarks. As you know, disparaging remarks about any of our identities don't rise to be illegal, but we still receive them and try to provide and note them for the documentation for us to understand the human rights experience. And we also reach out to the person who experienced it to try to address that and denounce it and talk with them about it. I know one of the poignant parts of the student survey to me was that request of try to do something to stop it. Don't spend time trying to make me feel better about what happened, but go in at the front end and try to stop it. And I don't know that having the words in the code will automatically stop some of those remarks, but it, so just getting clear on maybe what the opportunity is, and maybe what you're not intending might be helpful in that write-up.
Yeah, Gretchen, that makes me wonder, is another question for Dan. If we did have unsheltered folks as a protected class, would that mean that when our unsheltered folks are experiencing that kind of harassment behavior, wouldn't they then be able to call like that hate crime line that we recently passed in Oregon? Because I don't think that just one person yelling at another person qualifies as a hate crime, right? But if it's towards a protected class, it does, or bias crime. And I know that we recently passed those laws. So I'm wondering if that protected class would then give them that other resource. Am I understanding that correctly?
I don't.
Go ahead,
Go ahead, Dan. Sorry.
No, I understand your question. I don't know enough about that line to tell
Okay.
what sorts of incidents it's subject to.
My understanding is that the line does receive both reports of incidents and reports of crime. And Tricarico, unless there's something that I missed in the last session, I still don't think that the yelling rises to the level of being a crime.
Okay.
My understanding is it rises to the level of incident unless they're within the direct ability to carry out a threat. They're making a threat that could be acted upon in, but
Okay.
just saying things doesn't rise to crime, but certainly it's an incident that can be reported in.
Yeah, I think I'm also thinking of, I don't know if this was in the survey, but like one unsheltered person woke up to someone urinating on them, for example. I would say that falls into the crime category. Similar to, if people's belongings are getting stolen or destroyed, like I understand that probably complicates things legally because if they're in a public space, like who owns what, it's not private property. I'm sure that gets harder, but I still don't think that we are doing anyone a service by allowing that behavior to happen. I think people are allowed to have their things as long as they're not blocking a sidewalk. And perhaps that could be another form of the language we include, Gretchen, because I do like your point about this is not what it is. Like, we're not going to say people are allowed to set up their tents downtown and, someone with a wheelchair who's coming by and can't access that space because of that tent. Oh, we're going to, just tell them too bad, so sad. No, we're not going to let one person's rights infringe on another. And I think that your point of this is not what it is going to be really important, because I think concerns like what Dan brought up are going to be the immediate reaction of like, oh, you're saying that unsheltered folks get a free pass or they get special, accommodations. No, that's not what we're saying at all. So I think that's a really good point to consider when we propose this language. To Kathy's point of like, what are we proposing? I think it should include, okay, we want the amendment and we also want some explanation about what this can and can't do in terms of applying discrimination or enforcing the legality of it's not okay to discriminate.
Well, in the current chapter 97, there are references to state law, but there's a section labeled intimidation where it's it shall be unlawful for any person to commit any one of these acts. And it doesn't look like it relies on state law at all, but to tamper or interfere with property, subject another to offensive physical contact, publicly insult, or subject another to alarm by threatening any of those things based solely on a protected class. And so that seems like that might be an appropriate place to add housing status to that list. I know that is definitely included in the type of thing we're wanting to protect against.
Exactly. Good point.
Well, maybe it sounds like the group is interested in drafting up, based on this conversation and the examples of other cities, what it would be, what it wouldn't be, and begin to contemplate, maybe bringing it back for the group to review a draft and then on to the Human Rights Commission. I don't know if we've gathered other inputs or perspectives, but anytime we're developing a recommendation, it can be helpful to be thinking about who would be stakeholders or who would be interested in the conversation and be thinking about that. And one of the hard parts of this is we don't want to get ahead of our city council, and it can be really confusing when we generate a conversation at the commission level. It can be confusing. Wait, is the city talking about this? Well, we don't speak for the city. So I say that with a little bit of caution, but it can be smart to be thinking about what kind of inputs or research can be done at this stage while you're contemplating the recommendation to council.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Gretchen. I'd love to get Linnell involved, as I know she's familiar with the unsheltered community. And then I remember a while back, we had, I don't know if it was Linnell or if it was someone else who works with the unsheltered community who had that whole big binder. I think it was a study or a report. Do you remember that? So those folks might be worth reaching out to. And I do appreciate your caveat of like, this isn't the city. This is something that a small group is recommending to the HRC to recommend to the city. So we still have many, many steps to go. But I do think it would be helpful to get some of those folks involved. So perhaps when we schedule our next official meeting that hopefully has quorum, we could include them in the conversation.
I do remember the binder. In fact, it's on my desk at home because I
Okay.
actually use it as a reference from time to time. I remember the people who were involved and have their contact information. I contacted them a few months ago, actually, with a research question, and so I'd be happy to do that again. And then, yes, just spoke with Linnell yesterday, in fact, and I'm able to do that as well.
Okay, great, thank you. And then I'm sorry, to clarify, Dan, you were saying that we should probably have something a little beefier than just, hey, we recommend making unsheltered or protected class. So would you recommend that when we do make the formal recommendation, we maybe have like some example language where we're not saying, hey, use this language, but hey, here's kind of an idea of what we're envisioning? Would that be appropriate?
Yeah, I think so, along the lines of what Gretchen was saying as well.
Okay, and then so I think it sounds like we'll need, this is our proposal. Here's some example language. Here's the ways in which that language cannot be used, versus here's the ways it can be used. And then that I think would probably stave off a lot of the initial questions. But of course, this is going to be an ongoing conversation for quite some time, I would imagine.
Kind of going back a little bit to Dan's earlier comments, and just so you know, Dan, I'm very passionate, so I just speak what I think in the moment. So wasn't intending to kind of derail what you were saying. I do think, is it worthwhile to bring in the police department in the discussion early? Is there someone at the police department who is specifically tasked with dealing with unsheltered issues and seeing if we can kind of, make that clarification that that protecting housing status doesn't really have anything to do with the commission of crimes?
The entire patrol division addresses that issue. So you could look to the deputy chief or one of the lieutenants for that. I don't know. It'll be up to them to decide whether that's something they can do. And Gretchen can reach out to them on that.
Yeah, I absolutely can connect with PD.
I'm trying to think what else. So I guess as far as the enforcement piece, that's mostly going to be local law enforcement, right? Like we don't have to worry about setting up anything else there.
I guess the way I would envision it is the process, at least initially, would be the same as our other protected classes, and a complaint would come in through Gretchen's office, and we try to work through informal resolution. If we wanted to actually charge someone, with a violation or eventually a misdemeanor, that would go through the police.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Because I'm like, does that mean we have to set up like a whole governing body? Because that's probably way beyond the scope of this task force. Okay, good.
It might be analogous to the work we did recently with recommending the closed caption. So, if I were to get a phone call from a community member who explained that the closed captioning wasn't on at the restaurant or at the bar, I might begin by contacting that establishment and talking about what the rule would be. And if there's non-compliance after that, then you kind of start escalating and examining what could happen next and to ensure compliance. But it can begin with the education components or conversations and then escalate as necessary, unless the incident is immediately criminal in nature. And then the police department, if the person reporting it is amenable, the police department would get involved from the beginning.
Well, and I think the bonus thing, because Mike and I are so good at being involved with things that always connect together, is that our safe spaces can be a great avenue to help educate businesses in Salem about this change if it were to go through. hopefully by the time that happens, because I know it'd probably be a while, we would have that program in place. And that would be a really great way to disseminate that information and then talk about, okay, what is the process? Like Dan said, of first they're going to go to Gretchen and try to do that resolution, and like you said, unless it's criminal. So that might actually be another thing to include in our proposal of, it would follow this standard procedure with all of our protected class statements, that they would first be going to the city for kind of more conflict resolution. And then from there, so that would be kind of another thing to include.
Yeah. Very good. I think the only other thing is, while you're gathered, to see if you'd like to, if there's other parts of chapter 97, while we have Dan with us, that have also been on your minds. I know there was some interest in taking a look at the whole code, and I don't know where that interest is these days. And then finally, just if you want to set a next meeting time while you're all here together, or if you'd like me to send out a doodle scheduling poll, I can do that as well.
Gretchen, can you remind me if we addressed the issue that we identified in LGBTQIA a couple years ago? And it was about, there's an exception to living in a duplex or as a roommate that actually in our code allows for LGBTQIA people to be discriminated against. It basically says you can't discriminate against people living in your house unless they're gay, and then you can. Do you know what that section I'm talking about? And did we ever address that?
I remember the section, but I don't remember, and I should remember.
Yeah, I was just wondering about that too, Mike. Thank you for bringing that up. I think it was like a religious exemption that basically allowed a landowner or a landlord.
It had some basis in common sense, like if someone's uncomfortable living with whatever person, but it had some logistical problems. The main problem being, if you're living in somebody's duplex or you're their roommate and they discover that you're LGBTQIA, they can kick you out according to the way that was written. And so it has a logistical problem, even if conceptually it kind of makes sense on the surface.
Yep, you're referring to SRC 97085. My recollection is those exceptions were sort of parroting state law. Not that we have to do that, but I think that's where it came from.
Are you looking at the current code, Dan? So that would tell me that it remains.
Yes, it's in there. There's a,
Okay.
I'll just read it. The prohibitions in this chapter against discriminating on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity do not apply to, and this is the one that Mike had referred to, the leasing or renting of dwellings with not more than 2 individual units where one of the units is owner occupied. So a duplex where the owner lives in one unit. The prohibitions on discrimination wouldn't apply, interestingly, just to sexual orientation or gender identity for leasing that other unit.
And I always felt that calling out those 2 characteristics as an exception was inherently discriminatory, right? Like, oh, you can't discriminate on any of these other grounds, but these 2, if you're living in the dwelling, you don't have to live. It basically says you don't have to live with a gay person if you don't want to. Sorry, my dog's going a little nuts. I'll mute.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Mike. So that would definitely be another area I want to address, where I think all we'd have to do is then just recommend removing that exception. Is that correct? Dan or Gretchen?
Again, it gets a little more complicated in that we say a violation of the state law is a violation of our code. So if under state law, that type of discrimination isn't illegal, then we need to rejigger it a little bit. Not that we couldn't do that. That's for me to figure out.
Okay, yeah. So you'll look into that.
I can get it figured out.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know that Dan is Dan. I don't want to speak for you, but I think one of the ways
You're doing a good job so far, Gretchen.
What? I know. I keep doing it. I just caught your joke. I don't think Dan is able to spend a lot of time revising the code or working on potential changes without council direction. Since we advise council and not Dan directly, I think that based on an exploratory conversation, and you could then recommend to the HRC, and then the HRC could recommend to council that happen. And then Dan would go about the work of the legal analysis and the rewrite of the code to bring back to council for adoption. But I not to speak for Dan, but I don't think Dan can do that pre-work until directed to by council.
Okay, so we could still recommend it, and then based on that recommendation, Dan would then look at, okay, if the city adopts the recommendation,
Right.
then they would direct Dan to say, okay, is this in alignment with state law? And if not, how do we word it?
Correct.
Okay, got it. Thank you. So I would say that recommendation is pretty much ready. I don't know how much more we need to explore that. Maybe we could put the caveat of, we understand that this needs to be verified with state law. However, we recommend this being removed or reworded.
And just to be super technical, this isn't a meeting of the task force because you don't have a quorum. So the next time the task force meets together, you can either send that to the commission or, individually, one of you could just make the next commission meeting, make that motion to the commission and have them decide on it there.
Okay, great.
Very good.
Is there anything else that anyone wants to reconsider? I know I'm personally going to look at it again and just make sure, and I would encourage anyone else to. And if there's something that you want to bring forward at our next meeting, especially since this isn't our official meeting, I'm more than happy. Gretchen, you can help me make sure that's on the agenda.
Yeah.
That if there's anything else we want to address, we can absolutely talk about it.
I'm sorry, Tricarico, you cut out when you were saying that. If we do have thoughts or ideas, would you like us to send them to Gretchen before the next meeting?
No, feel free to bring it up at the next
Okay.
meeting, because that'll be our official one. If there's an area that you want us to revisit, let's talk about it as a group so we can include that in our formal recommendations. I think we're going to have a little bit of a list. We have at least 2 things that we're hoping to move forward with if that's the official meeting. I know we've got a lot of steps in between. But if you see anything in the meantime, email Gretchen or bring it up at the meeting so that we can be sure we discuss it.
Okay.
Okay, so any other thoughts or ideas on this? I'm thinking we'll probably do a doodle poll because we have some other people that aren't present that we'd like to invite. So that we can get the official, motion that we then go to the HRC and kind of get that in motion. It sounds like we've got kind of the basic ideas and we'll just kind of finalize that at our next meeting. Does that sound good to everybody? Okay, awesome. So thank you so much, Dan, for being here and providing us some guidance. Hopefully you'll get some more from us soon to move forward with this stuff. But in the meantime, I really appreciate you keeping us on our toes legally. And thank you to Kathy and Mike for being here. And thank you to Gretchen for organizing this. So unless there's any other comments, I think that's everything.